All right, welcome back, everybody. And today I'm very happy to have guest Julianna Raye here to discuss how unified mindfulness deals with some of the thorniest, most difficult, and obscure issues in contemplative discourse and practice. So maybe, Julianna, you could say a few words about yourself, who you are, and also about unified mindfulness, what it is, where it came from, what it's for.
Sure. I'm Julianna Raye, and I am the co-founder and head trainer at Unified Mindfulness. It's an organization that's devoted to, it's basically an educational platform for this approach, Unified Mindfulness, that was developed by Shinzen Young, which is, we're mainly focused, we're the official teacher training for the system, and the system's intent is to help people understand the principles that unify all approaches to meditation practice. And so, our aim is to, we're not a religious organization. We're really interested in how attention training benefits humankind. And so when people do a lot of attention training, they start to have what are called, altered states. And so we have to clarify what that's all about from our perspective. And that's I think what we're going to focus on today in our conversation. I'll say that my aim with Unified Mindfulness is to make it approachable to everybody, and to make sure that it's inclusive, that anybody who wants to learn how to improve their attention for their well-being has an easy way to do that. And so I really place a lot of emphasis on, speaking clearly and as plainly as possible. So it'll be interesting to, navigate this subtle, tricky territory and see how well we do at making it easy for people to wrap their heads around.
Great. And I think one of the ways that in the teacher training program anyway, that was very helpful is to always refer back to one's own experience, insofar as it's helpful. So I know that for you and for me as well, the beginning of training one's attention, it was not for me some kind of like, I don't know. It was rooted in a real desire to practically help with my own suffering, my being stuck, trapped in rumination, worry for the future, dislike of the present, and just a lot of difficulty. So while what we're going to talk about today might seem a little unmoored from ordinary concerns, for me, and I know for you, Julianna, maybe you'll be willing to share some, that's not at all where it started, and it's still connected to the everyday and the ordinary.
Yes, I certainly had no interest in states of consciousness when I was first learning to meditate. I really just wanted to ease my suffering, as you did, and felt quite desperate and was very skeptical. So, but I think that hopefully we can help people connect the dots and start to see the relationship between what we call transcendence and these wonderful outcomes that we can get from a meditation practice. So maybe we can draw that link a little more clearly today. Yeah.
Great. So let's start out with the word that you already brought up, transcendence. What does that mean? In various religious traditions, in English, transcendence might mean one of any number of things. In unified mindfulness, practice is organized, attention training is organized into certain categories, and transcending, in a certain sense, one's sensory experience of a self and a world is part of that. But what more concretely does that mean?
Yeah, well, and there are two ways to look at that. So there's a kind of a grid we have that will sort of emphasize themes that tend to come up as you experience more transcendent states. And so there's like a quadrant that's devoted to the themes that the sensory themes. In other words, the experiences that you start to have more commonly when you experience transcendence. But then there's also, well, what do we mean when we say transcendence? And the way we would frame that is that when you develop your attention skills, we say that any meditation practice you do, and in fact, even if you don't do a meditation practice, we can identify these attention skills, and we can say that when your attention skills are higher, then you're kind of on the moving towards transcendence. And that can happen spontaneously. It can happen because you train. What we can say is that if you know how to train your attention and you do it consistently, then you're increasing the likelihood that you'll have transcendent experience. And what tends to happen is as you train your ability to pay attention to your experience in particular ways. So as you develop the ability to pay attention to what you choose, which we call concentration, as you develop what we call sensory clarity, which is the ability to track and explore your experience in real time. In other words, making discoveries about what's actually going on in your experience, as opposed to just taking it at face value. And then when we develop this skill that we call equanimity, which we could say is kind of at the heart of it all, which is the ability to allow your experience to come and go freely without fighting with it, without interfering with it, without getting caught in it. So we can say that these three skills, concentration, clarity, equanimity, operate together. And when they're operating at a higher level, then our experience transforms, not because in a sense, not because there's something special about it, but because you're actually removing what gets in the way. We've kind of built up, you could say, like a plaque. We've built up interferences in our sensory system flowing effortlessly. And when our skills are heightened, the effortlessness of our sensory system becomes apparent. We get to taste what that's like. And that's another way to say transcendence.
So there's lots of ways to describe transcendence, but generally, just kind of summarize, by training our attention in certain ways, all of this can happen spontaneously as well. These skills can be temporarily, spontaneously elevated for a variety of reasons, sometimes seemingly completely out of the blue. And moving along a kind of a spectrum of deepening of those skills on the farther ends, it is more likely that you are going to experience altered states of perception in which the ordinary structuring of your experience becomes more fluid, becomes more effortless, and starts to generally just feel better in ways that we can disambiguate. And a big part of that is spontaneity, or what in is called auto. I don't know, maybe you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so well, so I talked about non-interference, or I talked about, reducing sensory friction is another way to think about it. That this skill equanimity is a way to talk about what starts to happen when you remove what gets in the way of your senses moving freely. And another way to, part of the challenge is, how do we put this into words? How do we describe this? And I think the challenge in general for people when they hear transcendence being talked about is we use words that reflect a perspective on transcendence, but transcendence goes beyond any particular perspective. So what you're left with is, you have to understand that fundamentally. You have to understand, like, everybody's just using words, and words can't do it justice, but we need to use words because we have to be able to talk about this common human experience. And it's part of our kind of, you could say it's part of our birthright to begin to get all the junk out of the way and start to experience the free flow of energy in your sensory system, like you did once upon a time when you were young. If you think about what's fascinating about watching a baby move around, there's an utter unself-consciousness about a baby. And you can, it's like you can almost see the puppeteer, it's like the baby's just being moved by the, by what, not, they don't take ownership. They don't say, I'm the one directing the show here. And we're fascinated by that. We love watching babies, the spontaneity in their movements. So spontaneity is a way, it's a term, it's yet another term to talk about. And we use spontaneity, especially in unified mindfulness, to talk about expression. So a baby is a good example, because we're witnessing the kind of automatic movements of the baby that just sort of happen. And we're drawn in because there is that effortlessness about it. And so we, as adults, knowing what we know, we can develop a relationship to a more spontaneous way of moving and a more spontaneous way of thinking and expressing ourselves through our voice. So there are these aspects of, there's the side of, there are lots of ways to cut up the pie as we talk about it. Remember, transcendence is transcendence. It goes beyond it all. But as we talk about it, one way to cut up the pie is to say, well, we have this expression and then we have this perception. And perception is, well, what's the sensory input that we're getting, and how are we, relating to that sensory input? And then there's what's our sensory output? What are we doing in the world? And that's where we tend to use this word spontaneity, just to have a word to talk about the effortlessness in expression. So there's the effortlessness in perception, which we tend to talk about as absolute activity, which we'll get to. And then there's the effortlessness in expression, which we tend to talk about as spontaneity. And of course, at the root of it all, transcendence goes beyond all those distinctions. So does that answer your question?
Yeah.
And raise about 50 more?
Yeah. Definitely no complication there. Yeah. So the classic phrase from the Zen tradition is pointing at the moon. And we don't want to get hung up on the hand or the fingers doing the pointing. So this refers not to an image in the mind, not to even any particular experience, but a transformed mode of experiencing. And even that doesn't quite do it justice.
Yeah, it's a reduction, mainly it's a reduction of friction in your sensory system, is kind of an easy way to think about it. It's, in other words, it's like, imagine that your sensory system is like a mechanical system, and imagine that, when a mechanical system isn't well oiled, the wheels grind against each other, and the energy output then isn't as efficient, and the car breaks down, or what have you. The mechanical system breaks down. Similarly, our sensory system, we have little ways that we relate to our experience out of habit, and because we were never trained in any other way, that build up over time and create these micro resistances in our sensory system. Not just, when we think of resistance, we tend to think I'm resisting something, like me, the person. But another way to think about it is, well, no, the sensory system is a system, and these resistances happen within the system. But we can do something about it if we understand that these are coming up. We have this antidote that has to do with how we leverage our attention, how we pay attention. And that's what another way to think about what meditation is. Yeah.
Another word that I've seen a lot of people take to is a kind of freedom from fixation. So our ordinary mode of experiencing, because of conditioning, because of various events and triggers and stresses, we become quite fixated, contracted, it's another word people resonate with, into a sense of rigid identity and limited action.
Yes, there are natural stops that occur in our sensory processing. In other words, if you think about a sound wave, if you're listening to a sound, you're not listening it might sound continuous. You hear a plane overhead, it might sound continuous, but the way you're taking in that information, and sound itself is a pulse. And that means that there are natural micro pauses in your experience, which is different from getting caught. And fixation is a way to say, we get caught on this and that. Our sensory system doesn't operate smoothly. Part of operating smoothly means these moments of coming to rest of sensory information. But that's different than getting stuck. We're not operating as smoothly as we can. So.
And I think that's a good transition to move on to what's probably going to take up the whole rest of our time together today, is this concept of the absolute. And to start with, maybe we could contrast an aspect of the absolute, which is absolute rest, with relative rest. So you've just given a brief intro to rest. How, if you could explain relative rest and contrast it with absolute rest.
Yeah. Well, actually, I wouldn't start there, because I think that's going to be confusing for the following reason. I would contrast absolute rest with relative activity and rest. In other words, absolute and relative are contrasted. And relative rest is really just a little less activity than activity. So let's take it from a different angle. Let's say that you reach a certain point where your skills are high enough, concentration, clarity, equanimity are high enough that you're experiencing what we call transcendence. And there's like a continuum leading up to what we could say, or there's a continuum of experiences that are sort of like on the way to this thing we can call a transcendent state, right? And you can get tastes of it. For instance, you can get like deeply pleasant flows of energy in your body, and you can get a sense of, even like out of body experiences. I was looking down on my body. So your sensory system is kind of, clearly pointing in the direction of transcendence. We could say that sort of reaches critical mass, or something happens that it gets to, and whether this happens spontaneously or whether it happens out of the momentum of your practice or what have you, the rhythm of this is natural, it's organic, it's not really predictable. We can set up the conditions where it happens more often, but and then we can get to a point where it happens so much that it can't not happen, right? But that's a natural process. So let's suppose that you are experiencing a transcendent state. So a temporary state in which you've maxed out your sensory system's ability to, be free flowing, and you're clearly aware of it at the surface of your awareness. And that's kind of one of the defining features of a transcendent state, is at the very, like what you ordinarily perceive gets replaced right at the surface of your ordinary mind. So, and what it gets replaced with is, you could say there are sort of two possibilities. And we call these absolute rest and absolute now, just to have names for them. One possibility is you have a generalized sense of oneness. In other words, by generalized, I mean all your senses, there's not even any separation between what you see, hear, feel. You can detect distinctions. You can say, I understand what see is, what hear is, what feel is. But what's primarily what you're registering in your ordinary awareness is what we could call oneness. In other words, there's no separateness. That's the primary awareness that you have. And then the secondary awareness is the ability to make distinctions. And so you can walk around in the world You know that you're not going to bump into something. It's just that you don't perceive yourself anymore as being separate from that thing that you might bump into. So your perception is registering primarily non-separateness no matter what. And it's generalized. In other words, it's everything is non-separate. So we can say that that's, we'll call that absolute now, just to have a name for that. And we can say that another way that you might discover transcendence at the level we're talking about is that you might get to a point where you perceive absolutely nothing, no light, no nothing, no body. So what is it like to have no sense of being in a body even? No light, no nothing. People can have a perceptual state without being on any kind of drug, that in which that is clearly what's happening at the very surface of their ordinary mind. Their ordinary experience is replaced by there's no body, there's no world, there's nothing to see, not even light. So we can say that that is a way to understand absolute rest. It gets trickier though. So we've got these two words that I just kind of described. There's the everything goes away, there's nothingness, nothingness, no form. That's absolute rest. Then we can say everything is non-separate and unfixated, right? There's no stuckness, there's no separateness. We can say that's absolute now. But then there's this interesting relationship between what we're calling absolute rest and what we're calling absolute now, because of course, it's not a relationship. They are one and the same because transcendence includes everything. So, but we have to have a way for people to be able to say, hey, I had this experience, help me understand it. That is the only reason that we go through the trouble of trying to disambiguate this stuff, because we want to help people free themselves, and because of the relief it brings, because it helps them contact their goodness, their sense of love and connection. So the aim here is to help people understand what's happening so that they can integrate these experiences. So I described there, I mentioned there's this relationship between absolute rest and absolute now. The relationship is that they are one and the same, and that really a way to think about it, at least the way we're framing it, unified mindfulness, we're saying really it all starts with absolute rest. So when you're experiencing absolute now, when you're experiencing oneness, what you're experiencing is a particular reflection of absolute rest. That's basically, and the reflection of absolute rest is form, that nothingness as form, right? So there's nothingness that's formless, and then there's nothingness as form. It's still nothingness, but it's, your eyes are open, you can interact with people, you can communicate, right? So, and for some people, for masters, this is like a default state. Nothingness as form, nothingness as formless. There's no distinction. There doesn't need to be any distinction to a master. That's sort of that they have gotten to a point where they're, you could say, the way we would frame it at their base level of these skills, concentration, clarity, equanimity, has reached a trait level. So it's like, these aren't just states that you drop into because your equanimity, concentration, clarity get high, and then they drop back down to your ordinary state, right? That master has gotten to a point where there's a tipping point, and they're rooted in that high enough level of CC&E that perception doesn't alter, doesn't fluctuate the way it does for, mere mortals like us.
So recapping and making sure we're on the same page, that I've understood, and maybe it'll clarify for the audience as well. In a state, or if you're a master, this is trait level. This is how you experience the world all of the time, regardless of circumstance. In a state experience with your CC and E, concentration, sensor clarity, and equanimity maxed out, of absolute now, absolute activity. While there might be distinctions and discriminations that the mind can make to orient and properly navigate, your sensory system is still taking care of business. The primary thing, which is salient in perception, is this non-separation, this oneness, and also insubstantiality, or kind of nothingness quality. And there's also an element of spontaneity, of just happeningness. So all of that at once. And
or you could say, depending on how so your mind is going to try to make sense of it. Your mind is going to try to reify it, is the fancy term for it. But basically your mind is going to try to like put it all together into something that will, help you protect yourself from predators, basically. So because that's what our defenses do. Our defenses kind of try to piece things together. So I'm separate, you're separate. So, part of that process is I have this transcendent experience. Now I have to get separate again because I have to protect myself from prey. So it's going to start to try to make a thing out of the transcendence. And that's natural. That's fine. It's not a problem. But we have to understand that's just what the mind is doing. And one person's mind may make it a thing this way, and another person's mind may make it a thing that way. And they're talking about the same transcendence, but one mind is reflecting it this way, one mind is reflecting it this way. It's ridiculous to get into a debate about it, but people often do because they don't understand that's what's happening. So I did want to make one caveat too, and then I know you have to still summarize more, but the other thing I wanted to say is, I don't know, to the extent to which a master, I don't know what being rooted in it, like just how far that goes on the, I do believe we're all a work in progress as long as we're human. So I think there's always work to be done in general. That's part of the human journey. But I guess what I would say is, to me, it's very clear that someone at a mastery level, we can say that at least they're like much more consistent than an ordinary person, much more consistently rooted in than ordinary levels of CC and E, I should say. They have like a base level that is so high that, but anyway, just want to make that caveat.
A useful one. And if you're taking this practice yourself and you get into this territory, it doesn't do much good to go, well, is it 50%? Is it 51%? What about, is it 60 or 60? That doesn't help.
Yeah.
So another aspect of it that you laid out is that at a certain point, the absolute rest, this total formlessness without a sense of body or defined space or location or anything,
light,
or anything,
mm-hmm.
anything. The rest is really is absolute. At a certain point, that ceases to be distinguished or preferenced between that and the 10,000 somethings, the regular, everyday, ordinary business of the world.
Not only is it not preferenced, you see that the 10,000 somethings are manifestations of rest. So there's nothing, the nothingness of the 10,000 somethings is, the rest pervading, the non-interference pervading all your experience.
And that's
so therefore, yeah, you can't say they're separate, because what is the nothingness of sense of the 10,000 somethings made up of? Nothingness is nothingness. How can you say, right? So yeah, and it's a perceptual thing. So it can be, and an expression thing. In other words, by what I mean by perceptual thing, it's ordinary surface level of awareness. There is not the sense of separateness. As you look around, as you interact with your world, and ordinary surface awareness, there's not the sense of that I'm the one running this show. There's not the sense of being the puppeteer of the, animations of the body and the vocal cords and whatever else. So it's really being in crystal clear contact, surface of awareness, that all of it is absolute.
Great. I think we've made this about as approachable as it can be, but maybe to go a little bit further. Some of what we've talked about, that it might sound, to that part of ourselves that is trying to maintain, homeostasis, keep the organism alive. Some of what we're talking about can seem on a visceral level, if you have this kind of experience, but also just even hearing about it, it might seem a little spooky. Like you lose the sense of control over your body and your vocal cords, and you don't feel distinguished from the wall in front. What? I'm sorry, no.
I know. It sounds like a good time, doesn't it? So yes, and that's natural. I mean, again, we're very well defended. That's what it took to get us here. I think our ancestors survived, and we survived through our ability to effectively avoid prey or conquer, whatever it is. So we have sophisticated defense mechanisms that are really useful, and until they're not, until they prevent us from accessing for instance, the deep wonder, gratitude, love that can be an endless wellspring when you do this work consistently. So what has happened for many of us, most of us really on this planet, is that, yeah, it's useful to preserve yourself. There's a utility to it. And we have, instead of just treating it as a utility, we've given it way too much meaning and importance and weight. And we've allowed the stories that come from our defenses, our fears, and what are our fears? What's fear really all about? It's about making sure that you don't get eaten, which is good. You don't want to get eaten. You're here on this planet. Let's try to hang out, let's try to care for this body while we're here. But, boy, we're really good at building stories, human beings. And ultimately, a lot of those stories are just fear-based. They're just reinforcing the fear of getting eaten, essentially. And that's not the best use of our time. So ironically, here we are protecting ourselves to make sure we stick around on this planet, and so much of our time is being waylaid into these stories about how we're about to get destroyed. And who wants to live like that? At what point does that quality of life start to, So I think what can happen is there's this argument, or there's this conflict that goes on, especially as we start to get some momentum with this practice and we start to have these deep experiences. They encounter our surface defenses, the part of us that says, no, I can't lose control, something bad will happen, comes into contact with, well, guess what? You never were in control. So, and that at the very surface of your awareness now. So what are you going to do about it? And oftentimes the answer is, I'm going to pretend this never happened, or I'm going to shut that down because that's dangerous, right? So we have to integrate transcendent experience, and integration is key. Otherwise, we're not getting the value from it. We're just going into these deep states and then coming out of these deep states, and the defenses are kicking back in, and we're just in this tug of war. So we have to learn how to live through the discomfort of that loss of control, that perceived loss of control. Let's be clear, you never had control. It's just that now you're clearly aware of what you didn't realize before. So, let's be clear about that. It's not that you're actually losing control. You're gaining a sense of freedom because you can participate fully in experience, because you see what's really going on closely through your direct experience. So really, I would say the journey is, so you develop these skills, you start to experience these states as a result of heightened skills. In order to keep those skills going higher and get to that point where there's that tipping point and you're just much more in transcendence as an ordinary way of being. In other words, your sensory system is much more free flowing with all the goodies that come with that. You have to, along the way, help, bring your defensive mind along for the ride. Encourage, reassure, talk to it, do what you need to do to encourage the part of you that's just trying to preserve you, that's just trying to protect you. Give that, have a conversation, I mean that like literally you can, but also just recognize, if you just know, oh, that's what's going on, my defenses are kicking in, but it's safe, it's okay. And they're building elaborate stories, and how can I kind of break down those stories so I don't get too caught in them, so I don't get fixated. So that's the journey. The journey is this integration process.
And that integration process isn't really complete without this piece in the happiness grid, which is something that has, and it's just like all of this is just useful tools. Hopefully exactly. They're helpful. Yeah. Which is broken up into columns, but one of those columns is connection. So through these transcendent experiences, it's not just you alone on your cushion doing your isolated practice. Maybe you could speak a bit how integration informs connection.
Yes, absolutely. I think that, well, first of all, if you consider that our defenses, the purpose of them is to self-preserve, right? So how do they do that? In part by orienting us as separate. In other words, where am I in the environment as opposed to that car, right? Because if that car is driving close to me, I need to know, I need to get out of the way to protect myself. But this habit of really reinforcing, I'm separate, I'm separate, I'm separate, also carries over, as I mentioned, into our stories, including the story of our relationship with other people. And of course, our social relationships, we're social creatures, human beings. So our social relationships, especially when we're developing early on, they're a matter of life and death. If we don't fit in, we run the risk of being excluded, and the repercussions from that, the danger of that, what that means for your self-preservation, your survival. So there's a lot at stake in our social relationships on the level of our defenses, which we don't tend to think about. We tend to kind of operate more on a surface awareness where we're just thinking about, like, I get along with you, I don't get along with you, but if you really look deeply, what is that rooted in? Am I safe or am I in danger in this social relationship? So one of the beauties of this training is that as you feel more connected, as you don't not just feel more connected, but at the surface of your awareness, discover yourself as connected, and couldn't be any other way. At the heart of it has to be this way. That really transforms your ability to experience connection that is both relational, like your connection with other people opens up because you realize, oh, I'm literally not separate. Now we may have separate ideas, separate beliefs. Okay, no problem. But, below that, we all have a sensory system, for instance, right? See, hear, feel. We all have some sensory activity that goes on in our system, or some sensory rest that goes on in our system where we're not getting sensory data from those ingredients, see, hear, feel, those categories. So, at a basic level, we share that we all have a sensory system. And even before that, we can say when our sensory system is operating smoothly, there's nothing interfering, we share an ability to be perceptually one, that we know ourselves as one at the surface of awareness. So we know that our actions are not separate from others, for instance, right? That's a very different way of knowing ourselves than the defenses will have us know ourselves as. And the defenses, like I said, serve a really useful purpose, but it's utility. It doesn't have to be the main course. So we start to know ourselves as oneness, as nothingness too, which is like, whoa, wait a minute, nothingness. The defenses don't like that, right? The whole point of it is self-preservation, and you're telling me I'm nothing? Wait a minute. So there has to be this negotiation process where our habits of defending ourselves start to understand, oh, it's safe. This is a safe kind of nothingness. This is a safe oneness. It's not the kind of oneness that puts you in danger of, someone trampling all over you. This is the kind of oneness that helps you be in contact with connection, no matter how that relationship is going, that you have a source of connection that goes beyond that relationship and that can also positively affect that relationship. And so, we tend to think of transcendence as this kind of non-humanness, and it is from a certain perspective. But what is the ultimate purpose of it, if not to connect more deeply and help people through our struggles on this planet, help alleviate people's suffering and help other people feel more connected and help ourselves feel more connected. So it's important to understand that these transcendent states don't happen in a vacuum. They aren't just a kind of form of sensory entertainment, because they can be experienced that way sometimes, but that they really are serving to clear out the sensory system of what gets in the way of the free flow of energy, which is just another way to say deep connection. And that deep connection, that is like at the trait level, that we are connected at a trait level, we're not actually separate. To know that clearly then translates into our connection with other people. And people experience it too. When you go into a room and someone is pissed off and they're caught in their anger, I shouldn't have done, why did they, right? You walk in and there's a cloud and you feel it, because we're social creatures. You feel the energy in the room. This person is angry. That's not like woo-woo stuff. That's just, emotional intelligence. We pick up on that. And it affects us because we're resonance machines. That's because we're social creatures. So similarly, you could say that when somebody is that rooted in connection, it goes beyond just an emotional state. It goes to an energetic state, in the sense that it goes to an energetic way of being, that there's non-interference in the sensory system. There's a free flow of energy. And that actually, we talk about, oh, they have good vibes or whatever. We try to put words to it, but actually dig a little deeper. And we can say that when you come into contact with somebody who has done the work and or spontaneously has their skills have reached critical mass, and there's drastically reduced sensory friction in their system, that conveys the same way that if they were pissed off, that would convey. And what it conveys is connection. It conveys, and what we tend to recognize that as human beings is love. So you get to experience more loving, become more loving, help other people contact loving more clearly, fully, as your practice progresses, as your training deepens. And whether that turns into, gee, I want to help people learn how to do this for themselves more directly, or whether it turns into you just affect people by your presence, or more modest things too. You just help out the way you can, or your relationships are more enjoyable because you're not as caught in the stories that you have gotten caught in the past. So it has an effect at all scales, at all levels of connection.
Thanks. That was exactly what I was hoping. Something like that was exactly what I was hoping you were saying, that these transcendent experiences of the absolute, to just put a sticker on it, they come back in the end to love, to connection, to a force for good, for oneself, for those around.
Must be a force for good, a force for freedom. When you disappear all the way at the surface of your awareness, lose that sense of I'm in a body, I'm in a world. When that really goes away, there's no freedom like that. And so then what is your sensory system discovering in that? Your sensory system is discovering freedom. And so then what is your sensory system conveying? Your sensory system is conveying conscious freedom. And other people's sensory systems register that, whether their ordinary mind picks up on it or not, whether they have a word for it or not, a sticker. We are social creatures, and what happens in our sensory system can convey positively to those around us. And that's kind of the best we can offer as human beings, is to spread greater care and inner freedom into the world, so that maybe we can have a kinder and more caring society, and a kinder and more caring relationship to the physical world.
And goodness knows we need it. If anything, these last few years have shown us just how deeply connected and dependent on each other we are, for our health, for the functioning of our economies, in our political systems, in our families. It's all of a piece, and everything is important. Every layer of that connected structure.
100%. And I want to point out too that this does not negate the value of making distinctions and saying that person's beliefs, for instance, cause harm, right? We have to be able to see, we have to be able to make those kinds of distinctions as a part of the process of changing, of improving the world. But if we make those distinctions from a position of fixation, that's when we get into trouble. If we are so caught in our emotional state, for instance, our anger, if we're so caught in that anger that we're dragging that around with us everywhere, that it affects the way we relate to people, then at a certain point, you have to think about the diminishing returns of holding your position. You have to get to a point where you can hold all positions light enough to let the light out, to let it in and let it out, and to shift your priorities that make it more important to love, and to trust that from love, from connection, you can also effectively problem solve. You don't lose the utility of these resources, of the intellect that we have, of the defenses that we have. You don't lose that utility. You just put it in its proper perspective, and it becomes in the service of the greater good more so, because you're more balanced in your perspective. And you know that because internally you're walking around in a healthier, more positive state. It's okay to give up your misery in the service of people's betterment and the world's betterment. You know, it's also okay to feel miserable. That can be a very good thing, until it isn't. So it's really about you know, I had a great I trained for a while with Noritake Roshi, who's a Zen master, and one of my favorite exchanges with him, I was talking about feeling worthless, and he said, it's good to feel worthless. And I thought, gee, maybe he didn't really understand me because I feel like this is interfering with my ability to, you know, be fully in the world. And maybe I didn't quite convey that. So went back in and I through a translator, kind of shared that perspective. And he kind of, he said, it's good to feel worthless. Just don't let it get you down.
And that's kind of like a bit of a challenge, a bit of a koan. And how do you manage that with CC&E?
Exactly so. It's good to feel worthless. Just don't let it get you down. Well, and if you get to the point where you are not so identified with this limited body and mind, then this limited body and mind can be feeling worthless, but it doesn't cause you to suffer. And it's hard to fathom that. It's hard to fathom how they can coexist comfortably like that. You have to experience it firsthand. But when you do experience it firsthand, boy, does that transform your relationship even to worthlessness. Then you see, oh, you know, there is some value, for instance, humility. If you don't have humility, you can't grow. You're impenetrable if you don't have humility. So worthlessness at its seed root, you know, we can see that it just got overblown. Too many stories built up around I'm worthless, and this is proof of it, and this person told me it, and then that person told me it, and right. So we build up a narrative. We make a legal case for how worthless we are in our minds, and I have a great intellect to make that case. So we build up a story, we solidify it. Why? Because we're trying to protect and preserve ourselves, because it's so ironic. So sort of like, yes, worthlessness, yes, must build up a solid self around that so I don't get eaten. You know, it's a whole thing. But in any case, when you soften, when you develop a different relationship to it, when you see the roots of it, I mean, the roots of it is really being humbled, and let us all be humbled. That's where the growth starts. So, but we have to get to the point where we have a balanced relationship, and most of us have an imbalanced relationship. We hold on too tight. We get too caught up in our stories around I feel worthless, for instance, and you know, we also don't know how to find just the right. It's like the Goldilocks effect. How do we find just the right relationship to, that's equanimity. How do we find just the right relationship to experiences like that, like feeling worthless, that that are so balanced that we can bring acceptance to it. It's okay. The feeling doesn't even have to go away because we don't self-identify with that worthless person that we see ourselves as. It's a kind of a paradox. But you know, what gets us there is this skill of equanimity, but that has to oftentimes be coupled with the skill of sensory clarity. We have to untangle, well, what is this thing I'm calling worthlessness? What's it made of? Well, I guess I feel some shame, and I have these thoughts, these stories that I'm building around it. We have to unpack what we're calling worthlessness in this case. That helps us have equanimity with it. So just a little window into how the skills, and we can't do either of those very well if we aren't able to concentrate, if we're not able to, focus on what we choose. So there's a relationship between all of those, and just thought I'd use that as an example.
All of the skills are mutually supportive and reinforcing, which is a good thing, because if they weren't, I mean, it'd be a lot harder.
Exactly. So yeah, to try to just be, have equanimity with feeling worthless, not so much. But if you know that you can unpack it, if you can say, oh, there are sensory ingredients that are giving me the impression there's this thing called worthlessness, right? And my mind is doing its job. It's pulling together the thing of worthlessness because it pulls together everything as a thing, because that's how it defends me. So defends and protects. So even worthlessness, unfortunately, the mind doesn't sort of make these useful distinctions between what would be helpful to solidify and what's unhelpful to solidify. It just solidifies everything, including this thing we're calling worthlessness. So you have to unpack it to the point where you see through it. Oh, it wasn't really anything. It was just certain emotions coming together combined with certain thoughts. And, caveat, this can be extremely compelling. The habit around this can run very deep. I don't want to suggest that, for instance, someone who struggles with depression should just unpack their sense of worthlessness and voila, it's fine. I'm not saying that at all. I have in my past struggled with depression, so I know how deep it can go and how profoundly painful it can be. And you do what you need to do to take care of that. You intervene in whatever ways make sense for you. But this can be, for some people, this can be one part of the puzzle that helps them manage really difficult challenges like feelings of worthlessness. And for some people, it can be all they need to untangle the experience, because for whatever reason, they're not struggling as much with it, or they have some momentum of training or what have you. So just want to put that in context.
Definitely. Other primary and supplementary supports, both just from a common sense, but also official recommendation. Please don't, use meditation or mindfulness and assume that it will work for every problem at every point. That it would be nice if it were so, but it just plain isn't.
Yeah, it's a deeply entrenched patterns, genetics, lots of variables that can come into play around this human condition. And I'm a big proponent of a lot of training, mindfulness training, if you are able to do that. But not everybody has the ability to do that, the time. So, and again, even if you do, like you're saying, it doesn't solve all your problems. You may still need supplements or what have you. So gotta take each case as its own situation, and apply self-care in the ways that work best for you.
Great. Thanks so much, Julianna. I think we're running up on time here. So is there anything further that you want to come back to or you didn't get to say?
I just want to come back to love as often as possible.
That's a good place to come back to. Good state of mind.
That's the aim.
Yeah. And for people who have enjoyed this conversation, maybe they want to learn some more, where can they find you, and where can they find
Sure, unifiedmindfulness.com. And we also have a core training the Unified Mindfulness core training, I think it's on Amazon. There's a free book they can download to learn all about it, or they can go to the website unifiedmindfulness.com/core, and there's a free video series. The book and the video series also can go together, and that's a great way. So you get this whole introduction that gives you everything you need to start your own practice based on the things that we talked about.
And the aim through all of it is to make it practical and accessible. So please use the free resources. Check out UM. Go look up Julianna. Other great resources. And thanks so much, everybody, for listening and watching. And I'll leave it to you, Julianna. Maybe you have just some last words before I shut off the recording here.
Well, it was a real joy, Weston, and you are a joy. What can I say except I'm grateful for the opportunity to support people on their journey, and grateful for the opportunity to know more love and connection. That's something that I never would have imagined at an earlier point in my life I would get the opportunity to live like this. So, yeah.
Right. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye-bye.